Well, I'm very pleased to welcome you to one of our series of Marshall Institute lectures. Marshall Institute looking at social entrepreneurship and philanthropy, but more generally at private action for public benefit. And I'm particularly pleased to be here tonight to chair a session with Nava Ashraf. The term star is widely overused, but it is absolutely unquestionable that Nava is a star. She is a star colleague, she's a delightful colleague with whom to work, but more importantly, she is a star economist. She is taking forward a very exciting idea, which we're going to hear some more about today, called Altruistic Capital, but in general, she has been something of a pioneer in a whole range of fascinating developments in behavioural economics, developments that are going to get, I think, massive recognition in due course. They're already getting a lot of recognition, but hopefully they will get even more massive recognition in due course. Nava did teach at, it's a smallish university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard, some name like that. She's now at a good place. She's Professor of Economics at the LSE, and she's Director of Research at the Marshall Institute. And she's going to talk to us tonight about altruistic capital. Nava.
Thank you, Sir Julian Legrand, who is one of my definitions of knight in his nobility. And I'm really grateful for that very kind introduction, especially because my mom is here and I'm sure she appreciates it and also believes it. Really happy to be with all of you tonight. So we're at the London School of Economics. How many of you have had an economics class? Yeah. Thought so. So if you remember, go back to your first economics class, and you probably remember one quote from Adam Smith, right? It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. And never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. This forms the foundation of our basic assumption of human nature that we base our economic models on. It's what we use to teach economics, a simplifying assumption, not one that actually most economists believe, by the way, but one that we teach so extensively that students tend to walk out of our classes thinking that it's rational to be self-interested. And the problem is we then move into teaching this in our business schools, and it becomes the way we form incentives in our work environments and the way we think that people will respond to those incentives. The problem is, of course, actually at its depth, it's not even correct, even from what the father of economics thought in terms of human nature. So he started his second book with this phrase: "How selfish soever a man may be, there is some principle in his nature which interests him in the fortune of others and renders their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except for the pleasure of seeing it. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of society, is not without it." So what is this natural principle? And is it actually something that is at play in our economic society that we have somehow pushed to the corner? Well, so it turns out that within economics, there has been, a few decades of finding increasing amounts of evidence for this natural principle. There's a growing body of empirical literature and especially experimental work showing just how much people are willing to give up for the benefit of others, for the pleasure of seeing the benefit of others. The challenge, of course, for the discipline of economics is that this experimental work is often in the lab, and although it provides some evidence, there is an easy way for skeptics to push it aside. So the natural next question is, can we actually find a way to leverage this natural principle and to see it within the field data? If we go back to the baker, Is there benevolence there, and can we leverage it? So that's the kind of first challenge that I'm going to talk to you about that we took on with my co-author, Oriana Bandera. You'll see her name over and over again. She's also a professor of economics, and she's my partner in crime in this whole agenda on altruistic capital. And you'll see our work that were field experiments in Zambia, just trying to really understand this source of motivation and how we can leverage it using field data in economic activity. And then the next part of this is, can we build that? So not just leverage existing sources of altruistic motivation, but actually build the capacity for altruistic action through the way our environment is designed. And that's what we'll end with. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A to really go to the heart of that. Okay, so the first one, how do we leverage this for economic activity? Okay, I'm going to show you a new technology. This is a female condom. It is the only way at the time that women in Southern Africa had to protect themselves against HIV. Now, imagine that you were trying to promote this technology. The thing about it is, like many new technologies, it's actually pretty hard to use at the first time. You need to ask people about it. You need to have trust. You need to have a repeated situation in the community. Where would you distribute it? How would you find people who were embedded in the community, who could help promote it, and where people trusted them? And this was done with Population Services International, which is a social marketing firm. And they found them in hairdressers and barbers, which are not like the hairdressers and barbers that we see. In Africa, they're on every corner. And they look like this. And people gather there and talk about the most intimate of matters in a way that generates a huge amount of trust. But then the second question became, how do we incentivize these guys to do this? Now, what do we treat them as? If we're thinking about these hairdressers and barbers as the army that's going to go out and promote this new technology that's going to help prevent HIV among women in Zambia, this was in the country of Zambia, how should we be treating them? Should we treat them like standard distributors? So Population Services International used private sector methods, and their motto was no margin, no mission. If you don't give a financial margin, people won't have a mission. So do we treat them like distributors? And if so, what should be the margin that we give them on that product? Should we treat them like standard volunteers? Or is there some other thing that we could do that could leverage their social motivation? So to answer this question, we had to think about the most rigorous study we could possibly do to be able to empirically understand the effect of motivation and the way in which motivation and altruistic motivation interacts with the incentives that people are given. And so what we did was do a census of 4,000 barbers and hairdressers in all of Lusaka, and we randomized them into 4 treatment groups. And let me tell you what we did. Those 4 treatment groups represent these different models. So in the first one, we gave a 10% financial margin. In the second, we gave a 90% financial margin. In the third, we made them pure volunteers. And in the fourth, we did a treatment that I'm going to talk about, which is a kind of non-financial motivation treatment that tried to act like a financial in the sense that it leveraged that amount of effort and connected people to the social impact they were having. And we did all of these also because, there's a lot of discourse about the way in which actually financial incentives crowd out altruistic motivation as well. And so we wanted to compare how people respond to financial incentives versus non-financial and versus volunteer. The challenge is, can you really compare apples to oranges? This is what people would say, right? So we had to do this in this really rigorous way, and when we randomized, we used like from medical technology, we used randomized controlled trials. And the way we did that was, as I mentioned, let me see if I can show you this. We mapped out the entire city of Lusaka, and we geocoded all the salons, the 4,000 salons. And then we gridded over all of them, and randomized them into 4 treatment groups. So what you see here, it's hard to see, but you'll see the 4 different colors represent the 4 treatment groups. And in between them are white buffers, so that people wouldn't be able to talk to each other as much, because people would get quite upset if they knew that somebody was getting a different incentive than they were. So we figured out what are the lines in which people don't talk that much across the city, and we created those buffer zones so that there weren't the kind of contamination that you'd be worried about, and we could really be sure that what we're about to see is really a result of the incentives that people were facing rather than any other things that would have to do with the experiment itself. And then they all came, and this was the non-financial treatment. So what this was a poster that you could put up in the salon, and every time you sold a female condom, you got a star. That was it. Really simple. But here it said contribution to community health. And the stars would go up. And at the end you got a ceremony if people reached the end. Turns out nobody reached the end there. But what was amazing was watching people and the way that they responded to this. They would pull it out and look at it and have it feel connected, even though it was very symbolic. So when we first showed this, people thought this isn't going to really make a difference. But let me show you what actually happened. This is the STARS treatment, which was double as effective as any of the financial treatments and the volunteer treatments. So there's a few things to note here, and this is over months and months of sales data. So the way we did that was not by self-reporting, but by actually getting people's sales data. And there's a few things to note. One is just the enormous impact of the STARS and this sort of symbolic treatment. The second is that whether you're talking about a 90% financial margin or a 10% financial margin, they weren't that different from volunteer. So it's not that the people on the financial margin were doing worse than the people in the volunteer treatment. So in other words, it wasn't crowding out like you would expect. Now, we're going to talk about this. Doesn't mean that money doesn't matter. It just means that money of this amount, which wasn't a huge amount for barbers and hairdressers who could, do another haircut, sell another shampoo, et cetera, for that amount. But what they didn't have in their lives was this ability to connect with the social impact and social contribution that they were making to the community, and this seemed to leverage that. And intriguingly, on the idea of crowd out, we then really wanted to get at this because this was so much part of the discourse that if we pay people for something that is pro-social, they're gonna feel a sense that it's gonna crowd out their intrinsic motivation. That we actually measured people's altruistic motivation to begin with in some of those same lab games that I was telling you about prior to them starting this through what we call the Dictator Game. Some of you may have played it. And where we see how much you've given to in the altruism game for example, an HIV charity that's local. And it turns out, we look at the people who gave more than average and the people who gave less than average. Let me show you how they did. So what you see here is that here are the high donation, low donation guys. They do pretty much the same when they've got 10% financial margin, a little bit better when they're doing volunteer, but not significantly. Here, they do much better. Everyone does better, whether you're low altruism to begin with or high altruism to begin with. Everyone does better when given the STARS treatment. But they also do much better when they're in the high donation people. So the STARS are basically leveraging high altruistic motivation, but so are financial incentives. So the highest donation people are also doing a better job when they get high financial incentives, so the higher donation people. So that, again, it goes against what we might have thought, that we offer high financial incentives to people who are already altruistic, and it might crowd out their altruistic motivation. Instead, it seemed to crowd it in. And so what we kind of learn is that, employees' pro-social motivation can be a source of value for the organization. As you saw, it's just as valuable, even more so, than providing the financial incentives. And that non-monetary incentives can be designed to leverage this altruistic motivation. The way that we thought about when we were designing the non-financial incentives was just the same way when we thought about financial incentives. We spent a lot of time in economics designing the right kind of pay for performance and designing financial incentives. And the idea there is to link the employee's effort, their employee's additional effort, their marginal effort, to the marginal profits of the firm, so that they can feel the connection between their effort and the additional profits of the firm. In what we did with the non-financial incentives, the idea was the same, that the employees could feel the impact of any additional effort on the additional social impact that they were creating. And they could be connected to that. And through that process, you could start to build what we call altruistic capital. And I'm going to go back to what we mean by that, is I'm going to build the definition through the talk and really kind of build it out after one or two more field studies. What I'm doing is actually showing you the evolution of this idea, which took us a while to really come to because we wanted to gather as much field evidence as possible. And finally, that financial incentives don't necessarily crowd out altruistic motivation, as we may have believed. Primarily because a lot of those studies didn't take place in developing countries, where actually putting money on something may actually provide a value. Unlike what people might think that we desecrate it. In fact, it actually may create an appreciation. And so we finished that study, and the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Health in Zambia brought me into his office with the director of research and said, we are about to launch a program of community health workers. Can you help us design incentives for them? And can you do what you did there, which is design non-financial incentives, because we have a budget constraint, we don't have that much money, can you design non-financial incentives? And so instead of just applying what we'd learned there, we wanted to really figure out what was this scenario. So let me tell you a little bit about that context, which is actually very similar to the challenge that many countries are facing. And it's a challenge of a massive health crisis. So this is a map of the world blown up by the disease burden. So you can see where the majority, this is malaria in particular, you can see where the majority of the disease burden is. And here's that same map by the proportion of nurses. So you can see that the places that have the most disease burden actually have the fewest health workers. And this is even worse in the case of physicians. So in Zambia, where we're working, the population is 13 million, there were 913 doctors. So the solution to much of this has been thought to bring community health workers, who are people from the community who can be upskilled to provide the basic level of care in remote areas. The challenge is, how do you want to think about these community health workers? And there had been 24,000 at the time in informal care, like there are in many countries in the world. And what the government of Zambia wanted to do was actually professionalize them and upskill them and formalize the sector. The problem is that not only were they trying to figure out how to incentivize them, but they had a more fundamental problem, which only arose after we were able to really talk to them about it, which is that they were very worried that once these community health workers became formalized, became professionalized, became actually part of the government trajectory and ladder in the Ministry of Health, that they would lose their connection to the community. That in fact, they would get the wrong kind of people in. They would get the people who wanted the career, who wanted the formalization, who wanted the professionalization, not the people who were really dedicated to the community. And so what we said to them is, that's a more fundamental issue of who do you bring into the job? So let's solve that before we even think about incentives. And the way we did that was to generate the knowledge together. Instead of sort of just giving them some advice, we said, why don't you're doing a pilot, let's use that as a way to experiment together and generate knowledge about what would be the best way to recruit. And so we took the first cadre and we randomized across the entire country. So there were 48 districts, 146 communities. We randomized which poster was used to recruit the community health workers. In half the districts, evenly distributed across the country, I don't know how well you can see this. Let me read it for you. It was the way that standard community health workers in the informal sector are recruited, which was, want to serve your community, become a community health worker. And as a one-year course in community health, and the benefits that were emphasized here were learn about the most important health issues in your community, gain the skills you need to prevent illness, work closely with your local health post, become a respected leader in your community. In the other half of the districts, we emphasized the career trajectory that was available to people. Now remember that both of these are correct. It was just about what benefits were emphasized in the job. In this poster, we said, become a community health worker to gain skills and boost your career. And the benefits that were emphasized were become a highly trained member of Zambia's healthcare system, interact with experts in medical fields, access future career opportunities, including clinical officer, nurse, and environmental health technologist. Everything else was the same. The requirements were the same. There's a preference given to women in both cases. You had to be endorsed by your neighborhood health committee. But the benefits were different. And then what happened was, though that's what led to the first recruitment, they were selected, and then they all came together and were trained for a year together. So just to let you know, the same number of women and men showed up in both cases in applicants. The applicant pool in the career treatment actually had higher O levels. But on lots of other fronts, they were the same. And then for a year, they trained together. And they were told, you're going to be part of this phenomenal army of community health workers serving your community. And you're going to have the career benefits of being part of the government. And so they were under the same incentives on the job. The only difference between these two cadres were how they were recruited. And so you can really identify the type of person that comes into the job, independent of the incentives when they're on the job. And here's what we found out. That those recruited and attracted by the career poster performed significantly better. So this is just on the household visits. The primary job of these community health workers in these remote areas is to do household visits and then to be able to refer people to hospital. And they did 31% more visits, which over the year and a half that we tracked them, turned out to become 20,000 more visits. That means if we had put the 146 community health assistants who were in the community treatment into the career treatment, there would have been 20,000 more household visits. They also did double the amount of community mobilization meetings. And none of this came at the expense of, for example, seeing patients at the clinic, which they also needed to do. It didn't mean that we looked for everything because we thought this is really extraordinary. Is it coming at the expense of something else? And it's not that they went to households and looked just for the father or the head of the household, the easiest one to talk to. They didn't just go to the easiest to go households. They didn't work less on weekends or do shorter visits. They just seemed to be doing more. And then, if these are just inputs, so maybe they're just really good at inputs, but the guys attracted by the community treatment actually are able to do something else, be connected to people in a way that would turn into health impacts that wouldn't show up in the inputs. So we did a full household survey randomly across all of the communities in which the community health assistants were there 2 years afterwards. And we got all the data from the health management information systems from the clinics themselves so that we could really look and see what was the impact of these various community health assistants. And there too, we find that in the areas where the community health assistants were recruited with the career poster, institutional deliveries went up by 31%. So this is in a country where 1 in 27 women die in childbirth over their lifetime, and it's quite difficult to get them to give birth in the clinics. And that's what's happening. The children's visits to health posts goes up by 24%. Under 1-year-olds receiving polio vaccination goes up by 20%. And we actually measured and weighed the children, and the share of underweight children goes down by 25% in these areas. So that's the difference that getting the right person in the job makes. But what is going on here? Because maybe, given especially what I would have shown you at the front, you would have thought that the right person in the job was the one who was most attracted by altruism. Here's what happened. So think about, when we think about social motivation, people are on a continuum, right? This is kind of what we saw in the previous study as well. You have people with half a heart and ones with full hearts that are really, really dedicated. Now, when you have really low rewards in a very pro-social sector, where it's really about giving service to others, you are going to attract the people with the full hearts, because otherwise, why else would they do it, right? I mean, if you're just thinking about the full hearts, that's what's happening. As the rewards start to go up, as the material rewards start to go up, you start to attract people who are maybe less dedicated, but maybe more selfish. Okay? You're going to attract these kinds of people to apply for these jobs, right? Not saying that these people are in the jobs, just that they apply for these jobs because, now there's additional benefits, right? Because previously the benefits were really from being able to do good. Okay. But then there's another margin that we care about, right, when we're providing public services. We also care about skill and ability. And there, it goes in a different direction. So here, the material benefits go in this direction. That the more material benefits you have, the more and more your applicant pool is going to have people in it that are going to be attracted by things other than just dedication to the public good. But on the margin of ability, so people also vary on this margin, right? I'm sure everyone in this room has the full head of tangerine-ness. But people do vary tremendously by ability as well. And the thing is that low rewards, just on the margin of ability, will bring in the people who have the least ability. Why? Because they don't have other outside options, right? So they will take the lowest paying thing because otherwise, if we're just looking at the margin of ability, through outside option, those are the people that are drawn in. As the material rewards go up, people that have better and better outside options with higher ability are drawn into the applicant pool. And so the highest rewards will bring in the people with the highest ability. So now imagine we want to put these two together because we want to get the kind of best people that have the smartest people, the ones with the biggest hearts, right? And there, we have this entire pool of all possible applicants, which have every combination of heart and head that you can imagine, okay? And with low rewards, only low talent, high prosociality will apply. Okay? As the rewards go up, you start to get the mix. Now, with the highest reward, you're going to get people in the mix who have the highest intelligence and the highest heart. And you're going to also have people who don't have either. The question is, who are you going to choose? And if you have a choice, you are going to be most likely to choose the person who's the best at both. And those people exist. A lot of those people exist. And those were the people who were chosen to do this job. So unlike what people had thought, which is that these things have to clash so much, it's true that they can clash in the applicant pool. But what it does to provide people with both the opportunity to develop themselves and to develop their careers, as well as to give to something that has a massive public benefit, is to bring in the people who have the best skills, who are also deeply altruistically dedicated. And if you choose those people, then those people have that kind of impact, leading to 25% lower malnourishment that you can see there. So when we bring these together, basically here in this paper we find that career incentives attract candidates who perform better and are equally likely to remain in their posts, and that these two main sources of motivation, unlike how we often think about these things, they don't have to clash. And they can be aligned in the service of both building human capital in the country through career ambition and providing better public services. And so if we then take this paper and the previous paper together and we think about what does it tell us about leveraging monetary versus non-monetary motivation, one of the first things we should take away is that it's not the same trade-off as is often assumed, right? But that we can potentially make the biggest impact by leveraging what is scarce in the environment. In the case of the community health workers in these remote areas, what was scarce was any career opportunity, especially for the most talented. There were lots of opportunities to serve and volunteer because there were lots of problems. But what was quite difficult was to find a way to advance your career. In the case of the hairdressers and barbers, what was scarce was the opportunity to feel connected to the social impact that you're having. And so that, of course, made us think, what does that say about leveraging that kind of altruistic motivation in the private sector? And of course, this whole time we've been talking about the public sector, we've been talking about what we call pro-social work. And that's another way in which we dichotomize the world into things that are service-oriented, that are public, and things that are selfish-oriented, that are private. But what if actually all of these things are providing some form of social impact? And in fact, in the private sector, it may be even scarcer to actually connect people to that. And that's the kind of next thing that we talked about. So we thought about, what do people thought is the most selfish sector that we can think about? And that was banking. But the thing is, especially as economists, we actually think that bankers provide a massive social impact, positive social impact, right? By allocating capital to productive activities, by preventing, destructive uses of finances. But it's not the way that traditionally is thought about. And then the question is, do bankers themselves think of themselves in that way at all? It doesn't matter if they think of themselves that way. So what we do is we partner with a very large multinational bank, and to do it's a long-term collaboration of co-generation of knowledge. And we have some people here, and this is also with Alexia Delfino and Luigi Zingalis, and our wonderful partners who are also here. And the first thing we do is we say, all right, well, is this even comparable to the way people have looked at the social sector? So we take Adam Grant's very famous questions on perceived social impact and perceived social worth. So those are questions about, do you feel that your work has an impact, a positive impact on society? Do you feel connected to the impact it has? And that's perceived social impact. Perceived social worth is, do you feel that people value your work and the social value it has in society? Okay. So we asked that of about 10,000 employees in 50 plus countries. And then we compare their answers within countries to the same answers to the same question that's been asked of people in the health sector and in the education sector, among firefighters and everything else that you can imagine as this question has been asked. We gather all that data and we compare it, just to see from personal reflection, do people feel the same? And it turns out, so this is in Australia, banking and pro-social jobs. This is in Germany, in Ireland, in the USA. That's on social impact and that's perceived social worth. That in fact, bankers feel very similar within countries to others. Now, this varies across time, so I'm about to show you something very interesting. But certainly on the surface of it, we can't say that, bankers don't feel that they might have a social impact, or they may not feel connected to the social impact that they have. And that this might be totally different from thinking about people in the education sector or anything else, right? So we start to think about this as a concept. I'm going to introduce more formally now, little bit by bit, the concept of altruistic capital and build it up in thinking about this sector and then moving it forward to the kinds of experiments that we're doing now. So we think of altruistic capital starting from the premise that every individual, whatever sector they're in, has some latent desire to serve. And that this is a source of motivation for the individual themselves and a source of value for the organization. Okay? And the idea is that this altruistic motivation can actually be leveraged. So the way we think about the leveraging is that the returns to altruistic effort depend on context-specific factors that can be shaped by policy or external events. Now, some of the way in which they can be shaped is what we saw already in the hairdressers, is by being connected, even symbolically, with the amount of effort to the social impact that you're having. But some of the other ways that they can be shaped is potentially by external events. And thinking about these as returns to altruistic effort or returns to altruistic capital is because they increase the benefit of any additional effort that you take, right? So as by taking effort, you see that you have more and more benefit, you feel more and more connected, that is a way of thinking about increased marginal benefits of the effort that you're taking. Okay, so about external events. So this is a graph of both perceived social impact and perceived social value in society, based on, by country, based on the degree of impact the financial crisis had in that country on unemployment. So what this tells you is that, you see here, this is perceived social unemployment. This is the change in unemployment from 2007 to 2009. So the financial crisis happened in 2008. And this is the perceived social worth across countries, and you can see it's pretty flat. the relationship, right? So bankers continue to believe that they could have a social impact in the work that they're doing, right? No matter what the financial crisis. But on the perceived social value, you can see this significant downward slope. So in countries where the financial crisis hit heavily, bankers felt a tremendous amount of loss of social value. And that's, I don't think, any surprise to anyone. Part of the reason we started this was because we met so many bankers here in London who kept saying that they were just ashamed to ever say that they were a banker, even though part of what they were doing was helpful, but after the financial crisis, just they felt terrible about their profession. And this feeling of that they aren't able to actually have the social impact that they want and that it's not valued by society actually has an impact on their performance as well. So what we do, this is just a correlation. So I'm not going to claim causality, but what we do is correlate this sense of social value with performance on the job. So performance on measures that you might consider more altruistic, like screening for financial crime, but also performance just subjectively by your supervisor, how well you did on the job. And this is highly correlated with your sense of social value. So it just starts to tell us that there may be something there in terms of this connection being something that actually has strong economic value. And that also there may be some kind of virtuous cycle. Here what we might see is a kind of vicious cycle where the financial crisis made people feel worse and worse about their job, and then to feel worse about their work, do worse in it, see less impact, and have this vicious cycle. But equally, you could have a virtuous cycle where you could do interventions where actually they're more connected with the social impact, they feel more valued, they're able to see the impact that they have from those that they see. And this leads to greater performance and greater social impact, and potentially accumulation of more altruistic capital. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that. So why do we call it altruistic capital and not just altruistic motivation? So the word capital in economics has a very precise meaning. So Solow really defined it well in thinking about social capital, because we can't sort of apply it to anything. It's really the way we want to think about capital is an asset that can be invested in. That's first, most important. So actions that are costly in the present produce benefits in the future. It can be accumulated and depleted. So those of you who've studied utility models in economics, you know that sort of we put preferences in, and there's no problem in putting altruistic preferences within utility maximization, right? We've been doing that for years, especially now with all this evidence from behavioral economics, we can do that. But this is different. Rather than thinking that these are just exogenous preferences given to us, the only thing within economics that allows those preferences to change recently in the literature has been that they may be passed down through generations. This instead says, you may have a set of preferences, but there's this other thing that interacts with your preferences and builds over time. And the best way for us to think about it is like a capacity, like a skill. And as you invest in it, as you do altruistic actions, it becomes easier and easier to do that. And one way to think about it is that it becomes easier because it goes from, those of you who study behavioral economics, it goes from system 2 to system 1. It becomes more of a habit. It becomes easier and more automatic. Or maybe just because you learn how to do it better. Or maybe because it becomes more salient, because you start to look for the opportunities to serve. But it becomes the way we think about human capital. It becomes a capacity. Frankly, those of you who are familiar with philosophy and religion can probably recognize what this is. This is really the way we think about virtue and the way that virtue builds. The thing is that within economics, we really haven't had a language to really understand this and to be able to think of something that over our lifetime can build. The character that we invest in through the actions we take daily, which then produces more and more benefits, which then creates more and more of a character in the future. And the thing is that there's a lot of features of this that change the way we think about it. If you think just about fixed preferences, right? that we have some set of altruistic preferences in the economy, and that's it. The only way to change what we might think of as a selfish industry is to kind of kick out all the selfish people and bring in better people, right? More altruistic people. This instead suggests that there are ways in which we could design work that would change the character of individuals. Again, that's a kind of a radical idea, but one that needs testing. And one that really is in great accord with a lot of philosophy and a lot of more recent neuroscience, in which we become what we repeatedly do. It also, in this formulation, suggests that initial investments, kind of an organization's designing better returns, let's say, to taking altruistic action, actually have high benefits. And they need to do less and less of it as time goes on, because it becomes easier and easier for people to do. So that's also a provocative idea that can be tested. And one of the ways in which we're looking at that is, for example, as an organization may want to incentivize, for example, volunteering in a skilled way and connecting to social impact, having a really big push at the beginning might create exactly the kind of culture change that makes everything else much less difficult going forward. And so when we think about this, we think about it not like a preference, but something that's developed over time and facilitates future and effective altruistic action. It raises a lot of questions. So the first is, how do you leverage existing altruistic capital within an organization? And I think as a result of both the papers I showed you, but also a lot of Adam Grant's work and other work, we have a sense of how that can be. We have a sense that if we connect people to the social impact that they're having, in particular, if we're precise about that, not like one day where we say, oh, isn't it great, as an organization, we're doing great things, but really a precise connection, concrete connection of your effort with the social impact that you're having. That is one way to leverage altruistic capital and to increase the initial benefits to altruistic capital. Does it only exist for traditionally pro-social activities? I think we can more or less confidently say that it doesn't, that in fact people exist all over, and we may want to break down those barriers of what we think are traditionally pro-social and non-social activities. And in fact, by thinking that doctors shouldn't be worried about money and their careers, and bankers are not going to be thinking about social impact, we really do bad and violence on both sides. We're not allowing the kinds of true motivations of human nature to be existing across professions. How do you recruit for greater altruistic capital? That wasn't as simple as we thought it was. You know, it's not just about appealing to people's altruism. Again, it really requires addressing both sides of motivation. How does altruistic capital deplete? That is something probably you all could have a lot to say about if you've been out in the work world. If not, I hope you don't have to face this. I think one of the hardest things is the feeling that you come in wanting to do so much good, and by seeing that you're not doing the kinds of things you thought you were going to do, you get less and less motivated. And that capital that you built, because it just is not getting a lot of practice and feels like it doesn't have any returns, gets less and less over time. And then, you know, the tragedy of that is, even after that, if you move into another organization that might have the right culture, it takes a little while to readjust. The other part of this that I think is really important is that, you know, every company now talks about purpose, the way they used to talk about corporate social responsibility. The problem is that if people just talk about purpose but are actually not implementing it at every stage of the organization, that can actually be worse for individuals, because what they might feel is a dissonance, and that dissonance between what people say and what they do actually can be more depleting than not having it to begin with. And finally, the question that I'm most interested in now is, how does altruistic capital accumulate within an individual? And for that, I'm going to put forward a couple radical ideas in the last couple minutes that we can just kind of explore in the Q&A or just to keep in your minds, because that does require a little bit of going back to philosophy and religion and trying to understand how we've thought about building this within individuals. And the first part of that is, since it's Martin Luther King Day, I wanted to start with this. So, you know, a lot of what I've talked about is altruistic capital that is affected by your environment, right? That's a lot about your doing. And the idea here is that the more you do, that is who you become. What you do is who you become. And that is for sure correct. But there's a lot of the micro decisions that determine, you know, how you think and what you are, who you are inside, that then affect what you do. And that sort of micro decision is what Martin Luther King talked about here. That every man must decide whether he will walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? So when I think about creative altruism and destructive selfishness, so again, we're economists, so selfishness can be great, right? It goes within the market, it can create all kinds of great things. But creative altruism is something else. It's really exciting. It's like you could find innovation that comes from just thinking, what can I do for others? What is the challenge that needs me right now? And so the idea that I took from this is, what happens if every day we're waking up and saying, the question in my mind, the most urgent and persistent question in my mind is, what can I do for others today? Who's the kind of person I become when that's the question in my mind? And then what does it change about the nature of work, any work that we're doing? How much does it turn away all of these barriers of good work and bad work that we've thought about? And that brings me to a quote that has inspired me my whole life from the Baha'i writings that says, work done in the spirit of service is the highest form of worship. So it's the idea of work as devotion, you know, but it's when work is understood as a form of service. So if the thing we get up every morning is to think, what can I do for others, whether I am, you know, sweeping the sidewalk or providing a loan or helping someone with pneumonia, you know, that is worship. And that type of devotional response to work is quite different from the way that we think about work in modern society. And it's quite a far ways away, but I don't think conceptually, psychologically, it's that far away. It is finding what you love and doing that work. And especially for the students here, there's nothing better than that. This idea of work is love made visible. So that's one idea I want to leave you with. The final idea I want to leave you with seems a bit strange, but it's the etymology of altruism. I started to become curious about this, so I'm just going to leave this thought with you. So here's how altruism came into our language. Okay? So interestingly, altruism as a word didn't make it in until mid-19th century. But it came from the Latin, which was to this other, which then turned into the Italian altri, which is somebody else, and the French altruisme, and then to altruism. So it's always been about the other. And even in the kind of provocative question I just asked you about waking up every morning and thinking, what could I do for others? It is about the others. It's always about the others. I guess the thing I want to leave you with is, what would it be like if we didn't have the others? The thing is that, you know, cognitively, we are wired for categorizing. And motivationally, evolutionarily, we are wired for tribalism, for survival. So we are wired for us and them. We are wired for self and other. And you can think, okay, I'm going to be altruistic towards others. That's great. That's a first step, and that's a lot of what we've talked about today. But I would want to put forward that a much deeper level would be to understand when those boundaries become porous and when they start to fall away. And we don't really have others. Thanks.
A wonderful combination of rigor and inspiration. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, we're now going to be open for Q&A. I'm going to abuse my position as chair by starting with a couple of
Sure.
Qs,
Yes.
and to get some As from you about specifically, I'd like to ask you about crowding in and crowding out. Now, you mentioned that the evidence about crowding, there is evidence of crowding in, and indeed you provided some in developing countries. There's also, of course, there is some in developed countries as well.
Yeah.
Particularly, there's an interesting study that looked at the payment of volunteers who were looking after caring for people who were not their relatives, either children or elderly people. And they were doing it voluntarily, and they were asked what would happen if they were paid to do it. And almost to a person, they were mostly female, mostly to a woman, they said that they would do more of the caring, not less, which is what the prediction would be. And when asked why they would do more, they said, well, it was exactly what you were saying, that it would be it would be an indication of the value that society placed on what they were doing. It was valuing the activity. But on the other hand, as you also know, there's quite a few studies that suggest there's also crowding out. And I think one of the questions we might, there's another study by Bruno Frey of volunteers being paid in Switzerland, and the moment they were paid, they stopped doing any voluntary work at all. But just only carried on with their paid work, and there are a number of other similar studies. And I think it's an interesting question as to whether we can identify the kind of external motivation, the kind of the payment procedures that create crowding in, and those that create crowding out. And I'd be quite interested to hear some of your views on that. Maybe I'll stop there for the moment. And do you have?
I think we haven't been as rigorous in setting up the studies so that we understand what people interpret from being paid. Because I think, like money, like everything else, it's like everything material has a symbolic value behind it, and so people are inferring things from it. They're inferring quality from prices, right? They're inferring what you want me to do from what you pay me. They're inferring whether I should be treating this like a commoditized activity, and so I think the way in which the payment is understood is the most important thing. So I think in some of those studies, if you were to ask the subjects, they probably would feel that, suddenly their work was being devalued by being paid. Whereas, in Zambia, when we asked the hairdresser, in fact, we did this in the focus groups, we said, if someone were to pay you, and they would be, no, that's great, because I'd feel valued by doing that, right? So for them, being paid was signaling that their work was valued and that someone thought it was important. So I think what we should recognize is that money is incredibly powerful in its symbolic resonance for people in our lives, right? And that how then we bring it forward is really crucial in what people interpret from it. So, and I think we can do that, right? We can. But one thing, the other part of this that I think is pretty important, and we have a wonderful research fellow who's the Reverend here at LSE, who's been doing a lot of work on the language of God and money, which is that we think about money as something that desecrates, but that doesn't. I mean, we could actually try to consecrate money and the activities we do, the economic activities. It's up to us what we want to create out of that money. It's a neutral thing.
I think I think you're exactly right. The language matters. Interesting in there's carer example. They didn't want their payment to be described as wages. They wanted it to be described as compensation or expenses or honoraria, something like that. Not as wages, because that signified had a different symbolism with them. Yeah. Second question relates to the idea of altruistic capital. Now, the essential idea behind altruistic capital is that if you perform a number of altruistic acts in one period, that makes it easier. You build up a set of skills, as you say, that makes it easier to perform it in the next period. is the same true? Is there an equivalent concept called egoistic capital, by which that if you perform a series of self-interested acts in one period, you build up skills in doing that and makes it easier to do it in the next period? And if that is the case, doesn't that relate to the whole crowding in, crowding out discussion? Because suppose a firm introduces a highly self-interested incentive scheme in one period, and encourages people to undertake a lot of self-interested activity as a result of performance-related pay of some kind, for example. Then that actually will build up their skills in that direction. In the next period, it will be driving out their altruistic acts because they were performing a larger period of self-interested acts.
That's a great question, and I think that's very possible on a dynamic level because. In fact, part of how we were thinking about this was in talking to so many people who'd been in these firms where they were being rewarded so strongly for selfish behavior, so much so that they didn't feel connected to the rest of their teams, for example, and they didn't like the people they were becoming because of the rewards they got in their job. And so that's precisely, what is being crowded out in me over a lifetime by the environments I'm putting myself in. So I think it's actually there, but possibly, I guess there is a constraint at some point. What's interesting is that if you were to take these studies here where we, either the hairdressers or the community health workers, I don't think either one of them would have thought of their activities as selfish. You know what I mean? Like, I think because they were service-oriented the conceptualization of them was for service. So although they especially in the community health where they were receiving material rewards, we wouldn't think of it as crowding out the altruistic motivation because they felt connected to the service that they were doing while getting the material rewards.
So the self-perception matters.
I think it matters more than we might think, yeah.
Okay, well, we are open to questions. If you're going to ask a question, if you're a student, perhaps you could just say, give your name and also which course you're doing. And if you're a non-student, you could just say your name and what your interest in the area is. So, that gentleman there.
David Rauch.
Oh, hold on, there's a microphone coming.
David Rauch, I'm a lawyer at Freshfields. This idea of employers getting involved in the whole process of character formation suggests some notion of what is good, what is a good outcome. What happens where the employer's idea of what is a good outcome doesn't correspond with the individual's?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, Professor Matrishka Tak is here, and he's done some very interesting theoretical work on how organizations which have different missions draw in people who have different missions and how they match together. So you could imagine also in a kind of market economy how being very transparent about the kinds of character you're trying to form in your organization would draw in the people who are aligned with your values. And they have this in the model, and I think we have actually a lot of psychological evidence of this, that when you are, and I'm sure you all, it's very intuitive, when you work for an organization where your values are aligned with what the people that they're trying to create, it is amazing how much energy is released and how much more productive you are because of that alignment. The problem is that a lot of times people are very aware that the company is saying one type of values, but they're not actually living that value. And that, I think, is the most difficult to bear.
Could I possibly come back?
Yeah, sure.
What happens?
Hang on 1 second. Hang on 1 second. Could you just wait for the microphone?
I can kind of see that works in a startup situation where you have a lot of flexibility about the organisation you're putting out there. If you're a very large bank, it's monolithic. You've already got your structure. People have come to that bank on an understanding of what it is. If management then suddenly change direction and introduce this notion of what is a good character, you're potentially cutting across decisions that individuals have taken in going to the bank.
Maybe. I mean, I think that's to be seen. It's not. I don't think that these things are so different from what people think in the. You know, if you talk to, for example, bankers in a monolithic bank, a lot of them have come to this themselves. You know, they visualize and conceptualize their work in this way, and so this is just about making it more explicit or more kind of transparent.
Yes.
Okay, so you've kind of conceptualized altruistic capital as this idea of the haves helping the have-nots, or someone helping another, right, for this idea of social impact. But how do you frame this kind of working for others in the context of the hustle, when maybe the person, the have-not, is also the person that both benefits financially and also has this implicit desire to do good, kind of this, I don't know, the idea of helping yourself while also helping others when you're in this kind of, may not be the person, you're the person that also needs help and the one that wants to kind of.
Okay, this is super important. I really want to, this is why I brought out the thing at the very end. And actually I have all of my students and my research assistants read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire before doing any work in development or in anything that's considered altruistic, because actually the idea that we are doing something for others, even though that is the etymology of altruism, is really problematic. And I think pervades philanthropy and is actually our biggest problem. So actually by understanding that we are in a process of building our own altruistic capital, all of us, by serving, and all of us are serving. And also we want to build our own human capital and our own career ambitions, then we're all on the same playing field. Then we can kind of be in a process together of generating social impact. Now it happens that I'm with, you know, the doctors and nurses and community health workers that I work with in Zambia to generate this social impact, and we're all together doing that. You know, and they're helping develop their career, and I'm also helping develop my career with the paper and also thinking about the social impact, but we're also developing our own sense of how to do better. And again, I think by creating these dichotomies, we don't help ourselves or help others.
Hi, Constanza. I'm actually in the social impact MPN in Nava's class. It's interesting when you talk about altruism, because you're talking about it in the sense of a very internal process where you build capital. But can you build this altruistic capital if the other, again referring to this, doesn't see it? How much is it about the actual good that you're doing versus the good that is perceived that you're doing, or you, like the same with the graph of the bankers that you were showing, like their self-worth versus what other perceived as that their contribution was?
Okay, so the most kind of, if we want to think about the most spiritually pure form of altruism or love for others, right? It has, you shouldn't even be thinking about, does this person perceive this or not? Am I, you know, seen as worthy by society for doing this, right? You do it anonymously, you do it, but of course we're human, and so we're in this like half-light world, and there it does matter. Now, one way to think about your question, and it's a tough question, it has lots of layers, Cookie, because I think it's something that is actually quite difficult when you think about, for example, the movement on effective altruism, which is really about, who cares what your perceived social value is? You should do the stuff that has the maximum social impact that we've measured, right? So get away from anything that is in your head that you feel connected to, and make sure you do the thing that is actually, that we measure having impact. The challenge with that, I think, is that it cuts off our font of motivation. And my hope with this, although I think, again, this needs to be tested better, is that by starting with the things that we feel connected to, the things that we feel perceived, we feel the perceived social impact, the perceived social value, we start to notice other things. We start to crave the objective measurement of social impact, the thing that is actually, so I start to do this work. You know, when I started to do development work, I would go to the villages and do what the World Bank had taught me initially, which was like, what do you need? And how can I do for you? And, you know, and it took a long time to understand this idea of really co-generating knowledge and impact with people. But I needed to start there and be connected to that so that I could start to understand the more objective reality.
So my name is Simon Altman, and I study economics here at LSE. I was curious how you reconcile the idea of moral licensing with altruistic capital. Do
you mean, just to be precise about what you mean by moral licensing, do you mean that people give themselves a lot of license to do things when they
Yeah,
think
if
that
I do
they're being
something good,
altruistic?
then I don't need to do something good in the next period.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so that's actually another form of crowd out, right? So the hypothesis of the altruistic capital theory is that more altruistic acts lead to more altruistic acts. Another hypothesis would certainly be that I gave at the office or I gave at church, and therefore I don't need to give somewhere else, right? And that can happen, but I don't think we actually have evidence either way. Now, one thing that I think is important is that you could imagine a situation where, in a static sense, you feel like, okay, in this one period, I've done my good, right? But then, over time, that good starts to get deeper and deeper, potentially, and you start to notice the other things you could be doing. So to actually empirically test this, we would need to be able to follow people over periods of time and the entire range of their activities. Part of what we're trying to do is actually, with some of these volunteering experiments, is to have them volunteer in one sector and see how it affects their other giving behavior. You know, their charity giving behavior, their altruistic action at the office, how they treat the other people that they work with, and over time. What professions do they choose, et cetera.
Hi, I'm Taylor, and I'm part of the Development Management Masters here. My question is in regards to altruism and whether or not you've sort of looked at forced altruism, on whether it's on entities or corporations in regards to regulations. And my question as well is being like in shaming that can happen, particularly when individuals don't participate in altruistic behaviors. Does that have a negative effect on their future altruism?
Yeah. I mean, I think we generally think of regulation and punishment as something different than facilitating altruistic action. Although, you know, in the end, it actually creates something that looks like a social good. But intuitively, I would say it probably has a very different effect. Now, but that's different than, for example, being encouraged in your high school to volunteer because it would do good for your CV. Okay, so let me take, like, you have regulation and you have shaming, right? Then you have the kind of like, you know, do good because that's what we expect of you, right? That's kind of on a different part of the continuum, but similar part, you know, similar continuum. I have met a lot of people who said, you know, I didn't realize how happy volunteering and service made me until I had to do it for some other reason. And then I realized, actually, first of all, it's easier than I realized. Secondly, it makes me happier than I realized. So even regulation could actually lead to some discovery. If it leads, for example, to the discovery that taking altruistic action, like decreasing pollution, is less costly than I had thought, or it makes me innovate on that front and makes it easier to do that in the future, even when the regulation is taken away, then actually it could lead.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very interesting presentation. My name is Mike Hoyle. I am trying to raise several £100 million to invest in care charities. And I think altruism is a very important part of our society. But I wanted to come back to management. Don't you think that people do altruistic, in part do altruistic, particularly when they're young, to develop their lives outside of, to have new experiences, to do things that they can't do in their job, and that therefore the management of the organization and the people they work for, I wonder whether it confounds.
Somebody,
That was a
they are really shocked by what you're saying. Well, do carry on.
Do you not therefore think the way altruism can be brought about does involve the management of the organizations rather than just the individuals? And therefore I wonder whether the extent to which you've taken that into account in coming to your conclusions.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do, is to actually, and a lot of managers are very interested in how to do it, but how to do it authentically, and not, but yeah, it can lead to lots of benefits.
Hi, I'm Thea Snow doing the MPP. I just had a thought about the field test that you did in Zambia, where basically you had two adverts, one which was community focused and one which was career focused, and you attracted community workers who were who performed better because where they were attracted to the career poster. I'm interested in the flip. So if you were advertising for a banking role, for example, and you had the flip scenario where you actually advertised for bankers who were motivated to make the world better, whether that could lead to interesting results.
Yes, indeed, and that's something we're talking about too with the bank. That was something that was of great interest to them. So it's exactly like one way of differentiating the work and seeing, again, I mean, I think you don't want to just be relying on that because you may not get the skill, because the skill might come from the outside option. But if you have, you know, the same salary and you have the same outside options and you add on the opportunity to be connected to the social impact and community impact that banking can have, then that could attract a whole other set of person who would never apply in the first place, but could have a major impact.
Hi, my name is Sina. I'm an alumni. I want to also go back to the study you did in Zambia, the first example of those hairdressers selling the selling the female condoms, and you showed the different ways they were motivated. Some of them through high remuneration, some of them through low remuneration, and one volunteer. And the fourth group was the interesting one because that was the one that was doing it for the altruistic aspect of it. And you showed a picture of this sort of chart that they ticked, and they got stars when they sold one of these units. Now, when I saw that, I thought about this game that came last year that was called Pokemon Go. Maybe some people here played it. And people went nuts all over the world chasing these imaginary animals. And it was completely pointless, but it was just something they wanted to do to reach this arbitrary goal. And is there a danger that we can sometimes confuse altruism with this gamification of a certain task?
Yeah. No, definitely, and I should have mentioned this, that actually that poster and that treatment confounds a lot of different mechanisms. So it's just one evidence, but basically you can see that there's a number of things going on there. First is like tracking your own progress, which already we know from a lot of apps that people like. They like to know, like, are they getting better than themselves, right? Then the second is actually social comparison. So if people are comparing with others. And the third is this kind of warm glow and connecting to the social impact. So there's definitely several mechanisms going on there. The reason that we think it's more likely to be warm glow is because it's so strongly associated with the people who have this higher motivation and this altruistic motivation to begin with, and it seemed to be so connected to them. But certainly we can't say for sure that it's only that that's going on. At the same time, I think, you know, given that we know that people love tracking their own progress and that they like to get competitive with each other, why not get competitive about altruistic action? Why not get competitive about something that can be helpful to others? I think we can incorporate these into the design of incentives.
I think maybe people respond differently if they're just starting a new job. Maybe they're more excited and their altruistic capital is high, and then maybe it's hard to maintain it over time. Or maybe if you looked at those health community workers over time, were they as efficient in their jobs after a few years? Or maybe if we can talk about, like, as we said, like bankers or firefighters, people who not necessarily who have the same social values, but like in different jobs, do they maintain the same altruistic capital over time?
Okay, questions over there?
Hi, Nava, big fan. My name is Lily. I'm a third-year economics student. When I was thinking about the graph with the tangerine heads and the hearts, I was thinking about comparative advantage. Do you think it's possible that for some people who are naturally not altruistic, that it would be actually better served for society efficiency to not pursue altruism capital and instead to build more tangerines?
I love that question. Spoken like a true economics student. That's awesome. Let me first answer this question. So we've actually just gotten the long-term household surveys, and in fact, this is 5 years afterwards, and they are just as good, if not better, now. And so there hasn't been a diminishment. In fact, there's been an accumulation. Now that, I think, is partly because they have the opportunity to keep advancing, and they're seeing the impact of the work they're doing. So that's crucial, because other people might get burned out because they don't see that. Okay, now to comparative advantage. So I think we often think of comparative advantage as having as you know, going towards the things that you are comparatively better at. Now, that is usually a different skill set, but it could be different set of preferences for sure. In a world where you don't think about just altruistic jobs, but you think that any job could be potentially altruistic, then you should probably just be doing what you're really good at and what's really needed in the world and what you love. And as long as you do that, and especially I would argue if you look at it within the lens of service orientation, but even maybe not necessarily, you could actually be benefiting society. I think then, if you take a step back, I think part of what's important here is that the organization should recognize that whatever incentives they put on you are going to either take that little bit of altruistic capital that you have, the tiny amount, and increase it, or it's just going to go down to nothing. And as a society, we may want to generate the types of incentives that help you accumulate altruistic capital while just having you specialize in what you're good at and what you love. Okay, good.
Our director of the Marshall Institute, Stephen Chambers, usually finishes these sessions by saying that that it's not only an academic exercise, but it's also part that what we're trying to do in Marshall, and indeed what these lectures are trying to do, are part of a movement as well. And I think by movement, in this case, the way I would interpret the movement that we're trying to do is to create better social science. And it's not only better in the sense of better science, but is also better in the sense of better, morally better. We're trying to create morally better society. Indeed, arguably that's the way the LSE was set up as its fundamental mission, through the exercise of social science, to create a better society. Now, I think Nava has just given us a remarkable example of better in both senses. A sense of rigorous economics, rigorous economic testing, social scientific testing of various hypotheses and propositions, but at the same time showed us how that applies to the generality of improving and creating a better society. So I would ask you to lift your hands and applaud a remarkable... Thank you. Thank you.